Don't you dare gift these cheap handmade items to me or my children, my sister-in-law mocked us while we were struggling financially. We left insulted. 5 years later, she is standing at our door. The air outside was crisp, sharp with the promise of snow. The streets sparkled under the soft glow of streetlights, their reflections dancing on the thin ice that had started to form on the sidewalks. The hum of holiday cheer filled the air, carolers in the distant jingle of bells, and the faint scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with the tang of winter. But none of that festive charm reached me as I gripped our modestly wrapped gifts, my heart heavy with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The car ride over had been filled with forced cheer, my husband's attempts to act like everything was fine, his nervous glances in the rearview mirror betraying his unease. I stared out the window, watching the lights blur as we drove, trying to convince myself that this Christmas would be different. That maybe, just maybe, she'd see us differently this time, but deep down, I knew better. When we arrived, her house was everything ours wasn't: grand, immaculate, decorated with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The front door was framed with golden wreaths, and the porch was lit with twinkling fairy lights that seemed to mock the dimness of our modest apartment. She greeted us at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the doorframe as if she had better things to do. "Oh, you guys made these?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension as she glanced at our gifts: handmade photo frames, knitted scarves, and homemade candles. I forced a smile, masking the sting. "Yes. I thought it would be nice to add a personal touch." She snorted softly, holding up the photo frame like it was some relic from the past. "I guess that's one way to save money." I clenched my jaw, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to break free. But she wasn't done. As the evening wore on, she continued her little jabs, each one sharper than the last. "Oh, you must have had a lot of free time to make these," she said, glancing at the hand-knitted scarf I'd made for her child. "And look at this," she added, holding up the jar of homemade jam. "How quaint. Is this the gourmet version of jam?" Her words were like tiny daggers, each one slipping under the surface of my carefully constructed composure. But it wasn't just the gifts, it was the way she dismissed our struggles, as if the effort we put into every small thing was insignificant. When her child opened the scarf, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "I guess it's warm enough. Though I'm sure it's not designer." I felt my heart tighten. Not because I cared about the scarf, but because of the way she belittled the love that had gone into making it. I wanted to tell her that while she wrapped herself in luxury, we wrapped our love in every imperfect stitch, every handmade creation. But instead, I smiled, because sometimes, the loudest statement you can make is the silence that follows. And that Christmas, I realized something important. It wasn't about the gifts, it was about the people who gave them and the people who chose not to see their worth. And as I sat there, smiling through the sting, I made a silent promise to myself: next Christmas, I wouldn't be the one sitting there with nothing but handmade gifts. I'd be the one with the power to choose who was worthy of my time and my heart. The years slipped by like pages turning too fast in a book I didn't want to finish. After that Christmas, I didn't think much about her, at least, not consciously. Life had a way of pulling you into its current, dragging you forward whether you wanted to move or not. We didn't get rich. We didn't win the lottery or stumble upon a hidden fortune. But we found our own kind of wealth, the kind that doesn't come with price tags or flashy wrapping paper. Our little apartment became our sanctuary. It wasn't perfect: walls that needed repainting, a creaky floorboard in the hallway, and the faint scent of old books and coffee that never quite faded. But it was home. I found a job at a small bookstore, the kind with creaky wooden floors and the comforting smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed me to surround myself with stories instead of the sharp edges of judgment. My husband worked long hours, and our child grew up with a resilience that I hoped they'd never have to explain to anyone. We made do with what we had, finding joy in the simple things: picnics in the park, homemade birthday cakes, and late-night conversations about dreams that felt just out of reach. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when the world slowed down, her face would drift into my mind. I'd see her in the pictures she posted, her smiling with designer bags slung over her arm, her child wearing clothes that cost more than our rent, her life curated perfectly like a picture in a magazine, and I'd feel a flicker of something, anger, maybe, or envy, but mostly, it was just a dull ache, the kind that comes from knowing that someone once looked down on you and didn't even realize they were doing it. Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything shifted. I was at the bookstore, sorting through a stack of inventory, when my phone buzzed. Her name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, my heart racing for no good reason. Why is she calling? I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen, then answered, "Hello?" I said, my voice steady but guarded, "Mary?" It's sister-in-law's name," she said, her voice shaky, not the smug, sarcastic tone I remembered. I need your help." I blinked, the words hanging in the air like a question I didn't know how to answer. "Help?" I repeated. My curiosity mingled with a twinge of irritation. "Yes. It's a long story. Can we talk?" I stared at the phone, the weight of the past pressing down on me. She's calling me after all these years, after the way she treated me, but then I realized something. Maybe she wasn't calling because she thought she'd get sympathy. Maybe she was calling because she had nowhere else to turn. I swallowed my pride, pushed aside the bitterness, and replied, "Okay. Let's talk." We met at a small cafe tucked into the corner of a busy street, the kind you'd almost miss if you weren't looking for it. The windows were fogged from the cold outside, and the aroma of roasted coffee beans mingled with the faint scent of cinnamon pastries. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, her posture stiff, her eyes darting around like she was afraid of being watched. She looked different, less polished, her once perfect hair slightly unkempt, makeup smudged as if she'd been too busy to care. The confident, smug woman from Christmas 5 years ago had faded into someone I didn't recognize. I sat across from her, my heart pounding, not with sympathy, but with curiosity. I didn't know who else to call," she began, her voice shaky, not the sarcastic, mocking tone I remembered from before. I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know who else to call," she swallowed hard, then added, "We're in trouble. Financial trouble. We've lost everything, our house, the car. We're drowning in debt." I stared at her, processing her words. For a moment, the old bitterness surged, the memory of that Christmas creeping back into my mind. "You laughed at our handmade gifts. You mocked us when we were struggling. And now you need my help." But then I saw it, fear. Not the fear of losing material things, but the fear of losing the life she'd built on the illusion of perfection. She hesitated, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her coffee cup. I don't know what to do," she whispered. I need help." I took a deep breath, letting the silence hang between us like a fragile thread. I wanted to say no. I wanted to remind her of the Christmas she'd mocked, the way she'd laughed at our struggles, and how she thought she was better than us, but life had a way of teaching lessons, and sometimes, the lesson was about compassion, not for them, but for myself. "I can help," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "But not with money." She looked at me, confused. "I'm offering you a job," I continued. "You're going to work for it." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she'd argue. But then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes." And just like that, the dynamic shifted. The days that followed were anything but easy. I wasn't sure what I expected when I offered her a job. Maybe I thought she'd refuse, maybe I thought she'd be too proud to accept. But she didn't. She showed up the next day, dressed in clothes that were just a little too tight, her hair hastily brushed, and that same nervous energy clinging to her like a shadow. I'd hired her to help with my small business, managing inventory, handling social media, and assisting with customer orders. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. From the start, she struggled. She wasn't used to the kind of work that didn't come with a title, an office, or the luxury of pretending to be busy when she wasn't. Her fingers fumbled with the paperwork, her attempts to manage the social media accounts were clumsy, and she frequently glanced at her phone, as if waiting for some kind of rescue. But here's the thing, I didn't fire her. Instead, I let her flounder, let her experience the frustration of starting from scratch. Because sometimes, the best way to learn is to fall, to realize that life doesn't hand you success on a silver platter. She grumbled under her breath, her frustration evident. I can't believe I'm doing this. She muttered one day, stuffing a stack of invoices into a drawer with more force than necessary. I looked up from my work, raising an eyebrow. Well, you could have chosen to stay in your bubble of perfection, but here you are. Working. Her eyes flashed with annoyance, but she didn't argue. As the weeks passed, something shifted, not just in her, but in me. She started to show up on time, her work improved, and slowly, that sharp edge of entitlement began to dull. And me? I found myself respecting her, not because she'd changed overnight, but because she was trying. The weeks turned into months, and the space between us grew smaller, not just physically but emotionally. I wasn't sure when it happened exactly. But one day, as we were packing up orders for shipment, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling with a far-off look in her eyes. I used to think I was better than you, she said quietly, almost as if admitting it out loud was a weight she'd been carrying for too long. I paused, my hands frozen mid-folding a box. I didn't reply immediately. I just watched her, letting her words hang in the air. She continued, I thought having money, having things, that it made me superior. But it didn't. It just made me empty. I swallowed hard, my heart aching not with anger, but with a quiet understanding, because I'd been there too, holding on to pride, wrapped up in the idea that success meant more than it did. Money doesn't define you, I finally said, my voice soft. It's the way you treat people, the choices you make when no one's watching. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and in that moment, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about letting her off the hook for the way she'd treated me, it was about setting myself free from the weight of the past. The snow fell gently that Christmas Eve, covering the world in a blanket of quiet white. The streets were lined with dim, twinkling lights, casting soft glows over the faces of hurried shoppers clutching their last-minute gifts. But in my small, cozy home, the warmth wasn't from the fire crackling in the hearth or the faint scent of pine from the little tree in the corner. It came from something else, something I hadn't expected. She was there, not as the sister-in-law who'd mocked my homemade gifts, not as the woman who'd looked down on our struggles, but as someone who'd been humbled, changed by life's lessons, and somehow found her way back to us. The table was simple, just a modest spread of roasted chicken. Some sides we'd made ourselves, and the same mismatched plates we'd had for years. But it felt like the grandest feast. We sat around the table, her child laughing, his cheeks rosy from the cold, and my heart felt fuller than it had in years. Then she handed me a small, battered box wrapped in crinkled paper. I hesitated, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She shrugged, her face flushed with embarrassment. I thought maybe you'd like it. I unwrapped it slowly, the paper rustling softly as I peeled it away. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf, uneven stitches, mismatched colors, and a small fray at the edge. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I looked up at her, my throat tight. It's beautiful, I whispered, the words trembling slightly. She smiled, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. I made it myself. We sat there for a moment, the room filled with the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but comforting, and then I realized something. This is what Christmas is about, not the expensive gifts, not the flashy decorations, but the moments, the imperfections, the sincerity, the forgiveness that comes from letting go of pride. I wrapped the scarf around my neck, feeling its warmth seep into my skin, and I smiled. Because sometimes, the best gifts aren't the ones you buy, they're the ones you give with your heart. Feeling its warmth seep into my skin, and I smiled. Because sometimes, the best gifts aren't the ones you buy, they're the ones you give with your heart.